I'm asking this question in context of Orissa, but I think I'm more familiar with Orissa, so it is easy for me to ask that question. But any panelist could, it's a question which possibly applies to all of you. See, to me, it appears that in Orissa, mainly it had been a kind of a process. I mean, you have tried to identify a lot of policy issues, a lot of things which are not happening correctly, right? So we are trying to correct that. So some investments are required in that. Now, though those basically are addressing the variations in climate. For example, this hurricane and the typhoons, these are basically variations in climate, which are likely to be more severe with the climate change. So if whatever action we are taking in this direction actually is helping. But there is another component of investment, which is going into infrastructure investments, like you are building roads, you are developing your cities. Now, if you continue to develop your cities near the coast, which are going to be vulnerable, you will be spending more and more money to protect them. Possibly, idea should be that we move a little away from the coast, we start developing new cities, which is a painful decision, but possibly a necessary decision. We don't build roads very close to the coast. We do a different thinking and system. Now, the question is, unless we address this, the solution, we might not be able to really effectively handle climate change. And if partially what I am saying is correct, in that case, we again, enter into that point that what kind of variabilities and what kind, how the future will look, it becomes important. So now Mani said that we have not used any modeling at that stage. See, this fancy modeling is one thing. The point here is this, what I'm trying to say, that when we invest MDBs and the countries, we have to have some idea that what are the likely scenarios. And I'm not talking about the huge variety of scenarios. There has to be some kind of mechanism which possibly brings down that variation to more likelihood range, where people who are working on then project design and things like that, they can respond more effectively. I mean, it should not be left to them to decide what is the climate change expected and how to respond.
Thank you. Any other question?
My name is Meg. I'm from the World Resources Institute, and I'm examining M&E for adaptation. So I have a couple of questions. I wanted to ask Mr. Collins if you could talk a little bit about the scenario addition in the TORs for Baffle End, if there were any sort of ways in which, or protocol that they went to incorporate these scenarios, what was the information they used, and how far in the future do they project their decision making? And then the second question is for the Orissa State Plan. You mentioned that you needed to do sort of learning by doing, but the problem with learning by doing is that you have to change your definition of failure. So I'm wondering in what ways you're able to learn by doing, but also not get disappointed, discouraged when perhaps you're not exactly meeting your deliverables. And of course, it depends on the actor, right? Everybody has different expectations. And one of the things that I'm finding to be true is there's this constant tension between the learning and the accountability. So if you could talk a little bit about that and how you're incorporating that. Thanks.
Thank you. Perhaps Norman, you would like to start?
Thanks for the question. With the Baffle End proposal, it's just at a terms of reference stage. They did do a screening to determine that it was likely to cause significant effects, which I thought was pretty easy. But there hasn't been a response to what is being proposed. It's in process. So there is simply a requirement to use scenarios to look into the future. And over the life of the project, which is 21 years is the projected lifespan. So it'll be up to the proponent to come up with a method that is that is acceptable to the review committee. But that's normally a fairly effective way to do it. So they'll have to come up with some realistic, but it has to, the thing is for the scenario development, it has to be relevant to the project. So they have to look at the project and develop the scenario sort of based partly on different things that are relevant to the project. So.
But also, may I please extend the question of the tension about learning and accountability, which is really interesting to other panelists that may want to comment. You don't have to do it, but if you want, please do.
Now coming to Mr. This question of we are doing a vulnerability analysis now. In fact, in-house expertise was not adequate, so we have engaged some consultants for vulnerability analysis of this action plan. So that work is in the process now, and we'll be taking those inputs for fine-tuning this action plan to some extent. When we are saying learning by doing, basically what we meant was the domestic in-house expertise that we had by working in the system, our people who, whatever expertise they had, we have taken that knowledge into this. Basically, that is what we meant, that it's your local domestic experience, because they are all working in that field for last 15, 20 years, some for 30 years. So that expertise has been taken into, that experience and expertise has been taken into this thing. That is what we meant that.
You want to complement?
Just on the learning by doing, the other interpretation is that this was the first action plan ever to be prepared in India. So we did not have any model or anything to go by. So it was all basically, we had to cook it right from the beginning. And interestingly enough, Odisha model has been now accepted as a model for other states in India. So clearly, probably we've been successful to that extent that we at least have been able to come up with a recipe which seems to be, tenable and acceptable to other states.
Perhaps other panelists would like to comment on the tension between learning and accountability. When we learn, we have to be able to accept that we may do mistakes and we will have failures.
And then we are using public resources, and maybe we could be criticized of not using in the best way possible. This is a real tension, so that's the question. So if anybody else would like to comment in the panel.
If I can add, I just think one of the, I have to say, first of all, it was actually, what we did was really cheap, relatively speaking, okay? So it was incredibly cost-effective, and as a mechanism for getting people to sort of think cross-sectorally, it was invaluable. So, I mean, I think that we're all learning on this stuff. I mean, we'd be kidding ourselves if we said anybody was doing anything else, right? I mean, we don't know what the future is going to look like. We're doing the best we can. So I think that what the goal has to be is really bringing the right people together with the right with the goal of trying to improve the way governance and government does its business. So. And I would say one thing that might be of interest to you is that actually the World Bank Institute has done some very interesting work on indicators and sort of indicators for adaptation, particularly on the agriculture side. So David George, D. George at worldbank.org has some really useful metrics.
Kulsum Ahmed, World Bank. Actually, it's a comment on this learning and accountability. Thank you very much. I thought they were all great presentations. What struck me was thinking back to the presentation, the keynote speaker's presentation yesterday, when he said essentially you need three things. You need improved technologies in order to address climate change. You need stronger approach with respect to policies and institutions and capacity building. But then the third thing he said was behavior change. And actually what struck me was it's not so much a tension between learning by doing and accountability as much as the participation in all of these different processes have actually been a way to do two things, to in a way start to begin to strengthen social accountability, but also at the same time for the participants themselves involved to realize, and whether they be in government or in civil society or whatever level of stakeholder, but to realize that, bring in that context of behavior change, which I think is a process, as many people here have commented. So just some thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think we have 3 minutes, which we could not use it. So may I please ask the panelists just to give us, before finishing, one thought. What do you think would be the most important recommendation coming from the work that you are doing for the rest of us in terms of a suggestion of what to do or not to do? Your main key issue you would like to highlight at the end of this interesting session? Starting by you, Norm.
Thanks. I think that I'd like to see us remember what the purpose of impact assessment was and should continue to be, which is to try to minimize the effects of a project, and so that we can sort of move ahead in the best way we can with sustainable development. And it's interesting for everybody because, for example, in the north, there can be some very difficult decisions that the impacts are just too big and not acceptable, and the development shouldn't go ahead. So it's not always a situation where the development should go ahead, but it's. I'm hoping that we can globally move to a point where we use impact assessment to look at a changing environment as well as the effects of things like permafrost on a project. I mean, I think we have a long way to go in environmental assessment to adequately incorporate climate change into it in all its aspects. But we're making progress, so that's positive.
And Janet?
Sir, I think basically we have to get the science right. We have to get the science right and be able to give it in an understandable format to the people who have to live with it, and get the participation right. So get experts who be they farmers, be they policymakers around the table to understand that science and to come up with strategies to deal with the impacts of climate change.
Lina.
From the point of view of the country environmental analysis, the dialogue is very important, especially that country environmental analysis, they use a wide variety of tools for determining the priorities. So, for example, and putting the priorities in terms of economic costs actually opens the door for dialogue with economic ministries, planning ministries, and finance ministries, which are also important for the growth and development of the country. For example, one of the results of the Indonesia CA was the importance of putting Indonesia on a more green, basically shifting the growth path of Indonesia to a more green one, and this is where these actors are vital. So dialogue is very important.
Thank you. Pen.
A participative and inclusive process where you involve all stakeholders and the civil society is very important. At the same time, scientific impact assessment is also equally important.
One thing we realized was that we should aim for perfection, because these things are never meant to be perfect. So we didn't aim for a perfect climate action plan, but we aim for a good action plan, which kind of fits the requirements of the client, of the government, and of the stakeholders. So that way, I think we were quite successful. And as Mr. Behra mentioned, we did not do a vulnerability assessment at the beginning, but then eventually we got it done, and that can then now be fitted back into the climate action plan. So I think everything need not follow a perfect path.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Hope you find this time that you invested here useful, and see you around. Thank you.